Good afternoon. My name is Karen Rogers, and I'm the Interim Dean of the College of Architecture, Design, and Construction. And welcome to the second annual Bob and Sherry Faust Distinguished Lecture. It is truly wonderful to see you all here this afternoon. I'd like to give a very special welcome and thanks to Sherry Faust, whose love and admiration for Bob and whose generosity have made this event possible. We're honored to be joined today by Dr. Vinnie Nathan, Auburn University Provost, CADC Dean Emeritus Dan Bennett and his wife Joan, and distinguished members from the amazing architecture and interior design class of 74. That's 50 years, folks. And of course, our distinguished speaker, Tom Kundig. A little bit about Bob Faust, and I say a little bit because it's really hard to fit Bob Faust into a few words. I actually have 3 pages here, but don't worry, it's double-spaced and 16-point font, so I'll get through it relatively quickly. Bob got his degree in architecture from Oklahoma University, where he studied under Bruce Goff, whose profound influence would shape Bob's life, his career, and his work. After graduating in 1956 and serving in the Navy for 2 years, he worked for Goff as construction manager on a number of Gulf Coast projects, and it was through this experience that he developed a lifelong dedication to design build. In 1964, Bob was offered a position at Iowa State University in Ames, thus embarking on another lifelong passion, teaching. It was also there that he fell in love with Sherry, who became not only his wife, but an invaluable partner in his endeavors for the rest of their life together. In 1968, he accepted a teaching position at Auburn University, where, to our great good fortune, he stayed until retiring as professor emeritus in 2012. During his time here, he maintained a small but exciting and innovative practice. When Bob wasn't teaching or building, he could be found at his desk designing. His office was stacked from floor to ceiling with study models and drawings. He designed places of worship, conference facilities, and commercial and residential buildings. But one project was special, a project he and Sherry started when they arrived in Auburn and continued to design and build for the next 3 decades. A unique project of townhouse apartments that they called Corrugated of Alabama. Corrugated of Alabama stands as a touchstone for numerous architects who were Bob's students. Bob mentored them in studio, and through their work helping to build Corrugated, they learned from and emulated his craftsmanship and perfectionism. Bob, with Sherry at his side as his major domer, and with his unskilled but enthusiastic students helping to build the project, deployed organic design and simple materials to transform the site into a place with a unique, truly Faustian identity. Bob never stopped teaching, whether he was 20 feet in the air on scaffolding or bent over a student's desk trying to help a young mind think through a design problem. He treasured his relationship with his students and was proud of their successes. He was proud to be able to share his knowledge and his values with them. He loved everything about making architecture, from study models to finish models, from quick sketches to detailed renderings, desk critiques to formal design juries, design concepts to construction. He was an educator, an artist, and a craftsman. We are so proud to be able to celebrate him today with this annual lecture. Thank you, Sherry, and thank all of you for joining us today. Now please welcome Justin Miller, head of the School of Architecture, Planning, and Landscape Architecture, who will introduce our distinguished speaker. Thank you all.
Thank you, Karen. My notes are at 8-point font, but only 1 page. So first, I think what I'd like to do is just let everyone know that we're going to have a slightly different format than what you might have come expecting. We're going to have a moderated discussion with our speaker today. So before we get going, first I'd like to do is introduce our moderators. So joining me on the stage, Professor Ernesto Babao, and Professor Jennifer Pindyke. So what we'll see on the screen, rolling behind our panel, is work that has been led by Tom in the office of Olson Kundig over the past 30 years. And as we move through the questions that our moderators have prepared, we'll have an opportunity for audience members to come forward, ask questions. There are 2 mics at the center of the space here this evening. So, class of 2024, I'm going to be looking for you all to come up and ask questions. Right? So now we can begin. So Tom, it's a pleasure to have you here. He is the principal, owner, and founder of Seattle, Washington-based Olson Kundig. He's a 400-person practice based in Seattle with offices in New York and work on 6 continents, so 1 left. Active in recent projects ranging from private homes to art and cultural centers. The work has received national honor awards, national housing honor awards, as well as the AIA Committee on the Environment Top 10 Awards. And as you probably all know, the work has been published worldwide and in numerous publications, books, and articles. Under Tom's leadership, Olson Kundig has received the National Architecture Firm Award from the AIA, has been included in the AD 100 list 14 times, has been named one of the top 10 most innovative companies in architecture by Fast Company 4 times. Tom himself has also been recognized with several honors for his work. He's a fellow of the American Institute of Architects, a member of the Royal Institute of British Architects, and has received National Design Award from the Cooper Hewitt Smithsonian Design Museum. Additionally, he's received an Academy Award in Architecture from the American Academy of Arts and Letters. In 2018, for his work as a member of the AIA Seattle, he received the Seattle Medal of Honor, which is the highest honor that AIA Seattle confers on one of its members. In addition to doing work over 6 continents, Tom serves on design juries and lectures around the world, including our own rural studio. Tom is known for careful attention to detail, daring, and engagement with context. We see that riddled throughout the work. Often, it's achieved through architectural elements that engage and adapt to the surrounding environment. And talking with Tom over the past day, it's pretty clear that some of that comes from his own background in helicopter skiing, dropping into remote mountains in Alaska, mountain climbing, and being engaged in the environment of the Pacific Northwest, a challenging environment, and one that is engaged through his projects. So we're excited to see Tom's work today, to ask questions and have a general discussion about the work. Tom, thank you for joining us. And as Tom comes to the stage, Ernesto will begin the questions. Thanks, Ernesto.
Hi, everybody. Oop, am I coming through? Yeah, hi. Thanks for showing up. It's an honor.
Thank you, Justin. Thank you, Tom. Thank you so much for being with us. We're honored to have you here for this event. So I have the first question to you. So we've been chatting in the last 2 days. I mean, since last night we had a dinner together about you growing in the mountains, right? So we were curious about how that experience of growing in the mountains informed your design thinking in general, how you're growing, your environment kind of informed that.
Well, it's a good question. And if I come to an academic institution like Auburn, I actually think I'm speaking to the students as much as anybody. I want to kind of make it's a semi-long answer, but it's a really important answer, is that people will ask me, well, how did it happen? How did your career evolve? Why was it, successful? I'm going to start by saying my dad was an architect. I graduated, to the those of you that were class of 74, that was my high school class. So I'm actually been around for a few years also, doing this for about 45 years or so. And I actually started out, and this is my important point, I started out not wanting to be an architect because my dad was an architect. So I actually resisted architecture for all sorts of reasons. I was more interested in the sciences. I was more interested in the mountains, mountain skiing and mountain climbing. There was a part of my life that I just found more compelling, and physics in particular was interesting to me. You saw some of the earlier images with the hot rods and the artists I worked for fabricating their sculptures. So it was kind of like there was sort of a pathway, and again, this is to you students. There was a pathway that I was taking a lot of different agendas along the way. I didn't know this, but all of them really led to basically my library, if that makes sense, of all the work I've been doing for the last 40, 45 years. It has everything to do with that background. And what I urge all the students in particular to think about is, if you believe me, that what you're doing now, beyond academics are clearly really important, but beyond academics, outside of architecture, can be those things that don't, I'm not suggesting becoming an architect or work on hot rods or do anything like that. What I'm suggesting is find a passion that you're interested in, and you can basically roll that into your architectural career if you want to. And what it will do is it will make your work stand out in the offices, if it's your office or somebody else you're working for, because you're basically delivering a design that has its own roots in your own history, and no one else can have that same history, if that makes sense. So I just want students in particular to understand that what you're doing right now has everything to do with your career. Mountain climbing was really important for me because I learned a couple of things. I learned the value of risk, which is important for architecture, and I understood the language for really hard work against all odds, where your soul will be crushed because of unforeseen things that develop or happen. I was lucky to grow up with some of the best mountain climbers in the world, and hard work was, it sounds so romantic in some ways, and maybe you're attracted to architecture or whatever because of the romance of it. It's not particularly romantic. It's actually really hard work. And John Roskelley, who I learned a lot about scheduling, which still to this day is important to me when I work on architecture. There are two things that architects and contractors don't do well, and one is scheduling and the other is budget control. And I learned, oddly, both of those, budget, I mean, you could argue what budget means in mountain climbing, but scheduling is really important. And John became one of the world's best climbers, would always say, before we even got out of the car, we're already too late. We're behind schedule. And so what I learned from John is that you have to begin to collect time with every move so that you basically carried a contingency to deal with the unforeseen surprises along the way. That was just one of the examples. Hard work, scheduling, and then just putting your shoulder into passion and risk. There's a lot of risk in architecture, and some of the things you'll see that I was lucky enough to do with clients that were also willing to take the risk, or frankly, a little risky. Does that make sense? In particular for the students.
Yeah, it makes sense. I mean, especially for the students, and since we have a lot of students here, you addressed the answer to them in many ways. So the next question that I have for you has to do with your first commission, your first project, and maybe you were just out of school, and then how that experience of designing your first project really informed you as an architect, or informed you about what it means to be an architect?
Well, so it's a little different for me maybe because my dad was an architect, so I sort of saw the process of architecture. But honestly, I really did. I tried to kind of, as I said earlier, I tried to keep myself away from architecture as much as possible. But it's bound to rub off. You're bound to understand something about it. My first commission was doing a remodel for my mom's best friend, and I was in the university at the time, and it actually remains a really important part of my career, even though I've never published it. It's been remodeled by 2 or 3 other architects in the meantime, which is also really interesting to sort of watch. But it was important, and I would urge you all to do that, is if you can find a small project with a family friend, do it yourself and discover really how hard it is to deliver terrific work, and that it takes, all of a sudden you're by yourself, and all of a sudden you have no one else to carry you. Again, it doesn't have to be a large project, it just has to be a small project. I think even when you're at Rural Studio, you have the group, you have your colleagues around you. Go out and do it yourself, try one yourself, and see how difficult it is, because you're making the decision. The other thing I learned from an architect that I worked for years ago is that any architect, Jerry had more, he felt he had more sort of regard for architects that did their own house. Now that becomes kind of difficult, financially, but when you make your own building, your own house, you're literally putting it on the line. You're making the decision. You can't blame it on a client, and it is risky, and it is a little bit scary. I'm jumping ahead to a project that my wife and I did, but based on that premise, to do it yourself, you have no one else to blame. And of course, your budget is tight. Your budget is tighter than heck. But the first project was important because I was really on my own. I had nobody else. And obviously it was a family friend. I learned a lot.
Mm-hmm. And now with all the experience that you have, would you approach to that project differently?
Actually, that's a really good question. I don't think so, because for some reason, what's really important in my, I think, in my career is I don't go in with an agenda. I would probably have a different result, but my agenda has always been, it's about context, it's about what I'm going to learn about that client, that landscape, this program, whatever, the technology at the time. That's the context. It's almost like a science research paper, if I will. You're collecting as much data as possible. Where it's different is as you develop your career, and those of you that graduated in '74 here, I think you'll recognize, I'm preaching to the choir, you will know so much more about architecture and what it means to deliver a building than you really did when you were a student. In fact, I always take the position that you actually, in fact, and my dad even said that when I graduated, you're not an architect yet. I had professors that said the same thing. You're not an architect yet. I absolutely agree. You're not an architect for years, because what you're learning in academics is so important, but it's not about delivering a building in true form. I will say Rural Studio really gets you started in some realities that I think are really important. And I didn't have those realities other than growing up working in construction sites. I was a laborer, carpenter's assistant. Well, that's really not building it yourself and or learning through the years. And at this point, I say I've got a lot of bags. I have experience. I know how to solve problems. When we get into really large projects, I'm bringing all the research and development and experiences I had in small projects, and I'm bringing them to those projects. I didn't have that when I did my first project. So I would say it was somewhat of a naive result.
So jumping off of that, can you give advice to the students about how to find your voice as an architect and how to build the confidence, or how did you build the confidence in your design process and your decision-making process?
Well, that's a really good question also. These are really good questions, incidentally. It's almost, these are just all my experiences, so you have to take this with a grain of salt. These are my experiences. I grew up with artists. I grew up with like really crazy artists, the Keenholzes, Rudy Audio, Harold Blaze. These are true artists. They were wild people. They were working at a wild time. They were all, I'll say, self-centered, like artists are. It's all self-referential, right? You're not really working with a client. You're working for yourself. And I knew I was never an artist. So I don't approach architecture that way, like I was saying earlier. I approach architecture from coming in and trying to listen to what the situation is. And then, to your point, the leap is how you bring your own DNA to that solution. Again, I'm going to emphasize, it came from what I was doing as a youth, and I was doing it at that time. I was doing all of those things. I was working on hot rods. I was climbing mountains. I was mountain skiing. I was working on artists' sculptures. I was fabricating. I was going to school. And I recognized that the confidence came from that background. I wasn't making it up. I wasn't learning it. I wasn't sort of repeating a magazine article. In fact, I'll just make a little comment about learning from magazines or learning from books. You're actually, if you're learning a style or an idea, like if one of my projects gets published and you go, ooh, I'm going to do something exactly like that. You have to understand that project is probably 5 years old. By the time it's designed, by the time it goes through entitlements, by the time it's built, and by the time it's published. It's a 5-year-old design. You can learn from it, but if you're actually seeing it as a step-off point, you're kind of behind. And you're taking somebody else's DNA, somebody else's client's DNA, because that's really important, and sort of, it's sort of like a second generation idea. That's not true if you've got the kind of background and if you've developed whatever you do, if it's poetry, if it's music, if it's literature, it just doesn't matter. But if you have your own DNA of things that you've been doing enough and that you have sort of an internal confidence about it, and you're borrowing from that, you're going to be pretty confident. I never really lacked confidence. And in fact, an artist was once got a huge commission. Somebody asked him, I forgot the artist's name. They said, are you afraid? And he said, no, I've got complete confidence, but I've got anxiety to do a good job, which I thought was kind of a nice way to say, got the confidence, you don't know where it's going to go, but you got anxiety that you want to do a good job.
So it's important to take risks.
100%. But you got to take risks, but I learned that in mountain climbing. You got to take risks based on practice, if that makes sense. You can't just go out there and do something silly and get in trouble. So even if you see the gizmos on some of these projects, which were really kind of risky at the time that we were doing it, I had enough background in physics and enough background in the extraction industries of our area of lumber mills. I worked in lumber mills. I didn't work in the mines, but I went to the mines. You know, I'd see these things, so I knew they were possible. And then, of course, we were working with somebody like Phil Turner, who's a genius at sort of putting together the engineering sort of components of these things. But they were hugely risky because no one at that point was sort of repurposing those devices into houses. Now you're seeing them done, right? They sort of start showing up. There's a little bit of an industry that's come out of those gizmos. It's like I took the risk, but the client took the real risk of doing this, and it was published in the New York Times, and it won a National Honor Award, it did all these things. Now, that sort of gives permission, if this makes sense, for others to do the same thing. But you do it the second time, that's the second time. So find your own gizmo, in a sense, or find your own DNA, or find your own agenda, and then take some risks. They don't always work. at least our business is not life or death. We talked about this earlier. It's just going to be embarrassing. It's going to be embarrassing for about 100 years. But I honestly, I've certainly made my swings and misses a number of times. They're not up here. In fact, I was thinking at one point of just going out and finding all those swings and misses and just having those as the images to roll.
That's the next lecture.
Yeah, that's a risk.
So speaking of clients, how do clients find you, and who do you decide to work with, and then how does the project start?
Okay, so I'm going to back into that question. Sometimes I'll hear from architects, they'll say, well, you know, you're really successful because you get great clients, and they want to do cool things. No, I'm just like anybody. I came from, you know, a background in Eastern Washington, Northern Idaho. I didn't come from a wealthy family. I had that one project was just a little remodel for my mom's best friend. So I started just like all architects, ground zero, and all it is working hard, trying to take incremental, nuanced steps to basically build your career again, back to the getting your soul crushed. Absolutely, all the time. There'd be something that didn't work. Either somebody didn't build it, or they didn't like what you did, so they decided not to use you. Those are pretty soul crushing, believe it or not. And the clients slowly begin recognizing, maybe I'll talk to Tom. But it's a long process. I think for me it probably took 10 years before I got a client that was really, Chicken Point, the one with the big window, before I got a client that I really felt like, or no, Studio House was probably before that, if you guys recognize it from the roll up there, where a client really just said, there's something about what you're doing that I'm interested in. That's a good client, but everybody, and this is my main emphatic point, when I hear people complain they don't get clients, everybody gets a good client. One point in your life, you gotta hit that, you gotta swing and hit that ball. And it's gotta happen at the right time in your career, so that when you hit that ball or you get that project, then you begin. And that was my life. My life changed after Studio House. It went into New York Times, and that's when I began to see my life change. Does that make sense to everybody? You all are going to get that softball to really do a terrific project, but you better be ready for it. And that means, just like in sports, you guys all know, in football, you better be well practiced so you don't drop the ball when you have a soft pass in your stomach or in your chest, and you drop that. There's nothing. That's just like disaster, if that makes sense. And everybody has that in architecture.
All right, excellent. So this morning we were working in Dudley Hall, and one of the interesting things that happens is that you pointed out some sketches that were on the wall.
Yeah.
So I would like to ask you about, or to talk a little bit about the importance of sketching and iteration in design process.
Ooh, yeah.
And how do you work through ideas to the final?
So everybody should go see Bob's archive drawings. I did not know who Bob Faust was, certainly know who Bruce Goff was, but that's a separate discussion about architects that are really terrific architects that maybe don't have the same sort of media sort of spread as other architects. So Bob's archives sketches, the most interesting ones for me, and Justin and I had a discussion about this, were not the renderings or the sort of beautiful drawings. For me, the best drawings, and this is why I think it's so important in archives, to save those little scribbles, those little sketches, those little, it's like Scarpa's drawings, which you all know are so beautiful, but really those are his working drawings. He is thinking out loud, or thinking with drawings, and that's the way I think. I think with drawings. I don't think with narratives. I don't think with, models, yes, but drawings are really important for me. So sketching is really important. And overlaying with tracing paper, Obviously, that's not used that much anymore, but for me, it's absolutely critical. So if I look at Bob's beautiful drawings, the drawings that are most beautiful to me is when he's figuring out the dimensions or he's figuring out a proportion. Those are working drawings to me. That's really getting into, in a sense, the brain of the person that's generating that idea. So they may actually be even like misdirects, which I think misdirects are actually pretty interesting. I'll tell you a little story if you kind of keep it in the auditorium here. I worked on St. Ignatius Chapel with Stephen Hall, and I used to do this lecture on, of course, you know, that just recently won the 25-year award. It's considered his best piece, and it really is fantastic. If you come to Seattle, visit it. I just was so honored to actually work with Stephen on that project. And I was just, you know, doing the technical drawings of the delivery. But I used to give a lecture of all his early naive sketches, and they weren't that good. You know, they were kind of like bad. And then Stephen heard that I was doing that. He goes, dude, what are you doing? You're showing all my bad stuff. And I go, but yeah, but people want to know that even a person at your level misdirects and thinks, and, you know, I just thought it was kind of important. But I don't give that lecture anymore. Put the kibosh on it. But I think it is interesting to see, again, in archives, see all the somewhat naive but misdirects, and you learn from those, and you have to do it quickly.
All right, excellent. So one of the things that you mentioned before is about the client's DNA. You were listening to the situation, taking the risk with the client. So how do you balance your perspective and experience with the client's vision and expectations?
Yeah. So maybe this is just my personality. I'm an adventurer at heart, obviously. And I could not be happier with my career, because my career has taken me in the mountains, into like Nepal, see monasteries that hadn't seen a Caucasian in 20 years, you know. So, and in Africa, you know, in really crazy places, Australia and New Zealand and India, Japan, all over. And a lot of it is in urban settings and also in rural settings. So it's all about adventure. I'm getting a little burned out about some of that right now because it really is sort of tiresome, but man, oh man, I'm so lucky. The point is, I'm interested in the adventure almost more than I'm interested in me. So for me, the clients, and that's why I like working with a lot of small projects, I'm interested in what's my adventure going to be with this client and where are we going to go? And I'm going to bring my own DNA and my own ego along, but I call it skiing the trees. Those of you know that ski, I actually enjoyed skiing. When I mountain skied, I enjoyed skiing the gullies and the trees more than I did the big open fields, and you just do a bunch of tight turns, because it was like jazz. You know, you took all your bags and you just figured out a way to get through the trees, and that to me is an adventure, rather than just having, you know, just this perfect little set of directed solutions. And I don't know, it's my personality a little bit. I think it is important. I think your architecture will actually not suffer. It will actually grow, because your client may come in with a naive comment. Yeah, I was just looking to see if one of those projects came up where it was a really naive comment, and I went, whoa, I've got to dig myself out of this one. And when I dug myself out of that one, it was like I came up with a whole new appreciation of what that client was actually looking for. And it's another thing in my DNA bag.
If I may, I want to jump back to Bob Faust and what it was like to see his drawings, but then also go and experience a project. And did you see the relationship between?
Yeah, well, he was a terrific architect, and I could immediately recognize it. And of course, I could also recognize my dad's drawings with his designs were very similar. You know, there was a generational thing that I recognized, and it was kind of heartwarming. My dad just passed away. He was 98 3 weeks ago or so. And so it was really interesting to see Bob's drawings. Now, my dad's architecture and my architecture and Bob's architecture could not be more diametrically opposed. I'm a rationalist, you know, I draw with straight lines and a May line. You know, I have a hard time with a curve. Apparently Bob did not have a hard time with a curve. And which is really, because I'm more of a science background, you know, I always try to think of things rationally. I'm always impressed with people like Stephen that can think in these sort of very poetic, sculptural ways. So, but something Bob had that I think we're losing, and this is back to the students, we're losing it dramatically, and I think the class of '74 would agree with this. If you're, and I'm seeing this in our office. Of course, we hire a lot of people, and the importance of the floor plan, the plan, is being lost. And the floor plan is the basis, and it's not like it's a two-dimensional drawing. A floor plan is just your guide to thinking three-dimensionally. Thinking in elevation, thinking in section, thinking in volumes. It's just a way for you to think and walk through a space. It's not putting on the goggles. It's not going through, you know, your Revit or whatever program you want to use, because it's almost like if you did it like we used to do it in perspective, you can kind of cheat. You can't cheat your brain necessarily, especially if it's complete. And you could read in Bob's plans how I could imagine he would be in the third dimension and visiting his projects. He was really good at doing very complex shapes and forms, but rationally. And you didn't feel like sometimes I'll get these student projects and they're kind of like super seductive in terms of sculptural shaping. Then you look at the floor plan and there's no way in hell you'd feel comfortable in that space. In fact, if any of you that sometimes will visit some of these world class buildings that have been recently done, wow, they are impressive as a photograph, or impressive and even in real life, but they're not impressive as a place to be. Mm-hmm. And that ultimately is the most important thing, is what is it like to be in that place? Because once you're finished with the overall joke, the next 100 years has got to live. And I can tell Bob's stuff, people appreciate it, they live in it. It has an agenda, clearly, but it's also beautifully assembled, if that makes sense.
Absolutely.
Floor plans.
You heard that, right?
We have a real problem, and it's real frustrating.
First, I just want to remind folks that at any time you are welcome to hit the mics at either side. We would love for questions from the audience at any time. So please.
Don't hesitate.
Yeah.
And I mean, because our office, if we don't have designers, technical architects, or construction administration architects, you're expected, like old school, you're expected to go through, just like me, I go through all phases on all my projects. So if you have a technical question of some project up there, weather stripping always seems to come up with the gizmos. I can answer those questions, and that's important to us because we don't think you're a designer until you know how to deliver the project, because it's so tough for people to build stuff. So if you know what the issues are at the end of the project, you're making decisions at the beginning of the project that recognize I've got to carry that thing through and explain it to somebody fabricating it on site. And actually that, if you understand what happens at that end, you can actually come up with better ideas at the beginning, because you can then take a commodity or an idea and you know how to modify that commodity or idea, where other architects are just thinking maybe shape, or especially design architects. In fact, I worked for a firm, that's all I did. I drew pretty buildings. I didn't, it was weird. And honestly, I would kind of see the group of us that were supposedly the designers of this large firm. It was basically the same thing. We were just sort of we're moving shapes around, if that makes sense. But once you start understanding a building at the construction end, you can start saying, ooh, I wonder if I could, and then it comes back.
So is that how you organize projects in your office? And Do folks work on the project from concept all the way through CA?
Becoming more difficult as we've grown, but that was absolutely the DNA of the project. That's one reason we've hired out people that came out of the rural studio. They've been terrific people to work with. Dan Rockwell's group, in Kansas. We want people to recognize that it's a hands-on delivery of all phases. And that's the other reason, even in I guess, I didn't realize we were 400. I thought we were more like 370. So that even a large office, we do very small projects. And so you probably see some of the really small projects up there. And the reason for that is we want everybody that comes into the office to see all phases all the way through the project. So you're part of the scribble with, and there are 5 owners. You work with me on my projects. I'm following you through all the phases. And because you're working on small projects, you're seeing the loop of work, what it takes to deliver. And on large projects, some of these projects take 10, 15 years. And if you're stuck on one project without those small projects, you're just learning 10 or 15 years of experience. Does that make sense? We want everybody to understand if you're working on a large project, you're also working on 2 or 3 small projects. It's critical, I think.
Excellent. So I want to connect the next question also with both Faust. We saw his house, right? He was able to design for himself in a way. So have you designed any projects for yourself or for any other architect?
Oh, yeah. Well, my wife and I did our house, and, well, she's forceful with her opinions. And so that was an interesting experience because, when an architect works with a forceful spouse, that's actually a really interesting process. And it's the Hot Rod House. It's in the first book. And honestly, that house, the context of that house was not only my wife, but also it was a significantly invasive remodel of an existing house. So in a weird way, it's one of my favorite projects because it is so full. And it was an R&D. I mean, I have so many things in that house that I couldn't do for a client because I'd be sued. It was like, and I remember saying it to our attorney. I said, well, you can't sue yourself, can you? And he goes, it wouldn't be a good idea. So I took risks on our house, and they worked out, but I still wouldn't do them. It wouldn't be in sort of the level of architecture responsibility would not meet that level. So that was our house. And then I was doing a lecture in Reno, Nevada, and I don't know, those of you who know Greg Faulkner, terrific architect. And he came up to me after the lecture, he introduced himself, and he said, great work, Tom. And I said, oh, Greg Faulkner, fantastic. I love your work. And he goes, thanks. And this is my wife, Lisa. And Lisa wants to hire you to do our 5th house, our last house. And I looked at him, I said, I know exactly why you're asking me. And so people then always ask me, well, how did that go? Because Greg is a very forceful architect. It couldn't have been better. It was a colleague. It was a conversation. He recognized the agenda. It was actually, I'd like to work with architects for the rest of my career. It's just, it's like working with a friend or a colleague. And the house is, I think we call it Truckee House, the one in Martis Camp in Lake Tahoe.
So maybe you were your best client, right? I mean, working with your wife. But what separates a good client from a bad or a great client?
Okay, that's actually a really good question too. First of all, a client, I think I had a client ask me, after a big interview, how can I, and he used a profane word, up this project? And I never had a client asked me that question. I said, well, you just got to trust me. If you don't trust me that I'm going to deliver something that you and your family are going to like, then don't hire me. Hire somebody else. And I'll help you find somebody else. If you don't trust me, don't do that. And I think trust is the most important part of what, and it doesn't matter what the budget is. You just got to trust the client. The client has to trust you, and it is a completely wonderful experience through thick and thin, because architecture, there's a lot of thick and thin in every project. There's a lot of emotion, there's a lot of financial stuff involved, and there's a lot of risk. But if you go through the project as colleagues and as friends, as trusted colleagues, that particular colleague now, our friend, client, has hired us for 5 projects.
Wow. Question from the audience.
Pull this off here. Having built and constructed so many captivating things that require high levels of skill, how have you navigated the environment right now with the absence of skilled trades? How have you sort of approached a lot of those battles? And I think I'm interested, have you been tempted to actually get out there yourself and say, hey, let me do this?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and I get it asked all the time in different parts of the country. We're kind of lucky in the Northwest that there's actually a pretty strong craft culture that was really affected in pandemic. There was a lot of craft disappeared. But I will say every area that we work in, there is somebody that I think can deliver that kind of craft. I clearly saw it in Bob Faust's projects, that there, and these were students, that with care, you can, if you care about what you're doing, you can deliver a good project. What I'm finding, it is true, the crafts are sort of disappearing, and it's becoming incredibly expensive to actually deliver some of the craft that we have in the past. So the way I approach it, knowing how expensive building is now, if you look at a lot, and again, this is back to, I'm a rationalist, a little different than Bob. I try to make my buildings as simple as possible so those can be built relatively effectively or efficiently, and then take whatever I have left over and do 1 or 2 things that are kind of expensive. And you do the research, you find the builders or the craftsperson, and because back to having built some stuff myself or been involved in building some, there's a level of respect on both sides, so the craftsperson you recognize how difficult it is, what they do, and you work with them, you listen to them, and you'll actually get fantastic results. They're even at a higher level than they expect. I've actually had an electrician once tear up because I recommended, I kind of commented on his conduit work, you know, and I thought it was beautiful, and I just said something, and he actually teared up. He said, I've never heard anybody say it was beautiful. But I meant it. I wasn't just trying to be nice. I just thought it was great. And boy, he was my best pal in the electrical, and it was great, you know, because he did really beautiful work. He would actually line up on all conduit, the printing, no matter, so it all fit together. And all that meant, it was kind of crazy in a way, but all it meant he cared about what he was doing, and fantastic.
So you joined Olson Kundig in the mid-'80s.
Mm-hmm.
And how has your practice and you've grown exponentially. How have things changed?
Well, I just saw a colleague. He was employee number 44. You know, the firm had already been around for I think probably about 18 years, something like that. I was 45, and when we started, within 2 weeks, the firm of 12 people was 7. It wasn't looking good. I mean, it was like we were basically the firm was kind of going bankrupt. And this is also for the students. If you're, I don't know how to describe it. I'll try to back into this carefully. If you're trying to make a bunch of money in architecture, you're probably in the wrong business, but you can do very well financially in the architecture business. but you should never think about making money in the architecture business. So Tony and I were like shouldering it enough to the firm that was basically going bankrupt that we were working 50 hours a week and getting paid between 25 and 30 hours of those weeks. Now, you can't do that anymore, but back then you could. And of course, we were was 14 bucks an hour, 12 bucks an hour, something like that. But it was just a commitment to an unknown future, and this is what I guess I'm trying to stress is just work hard, be loyal to a good group of people, and I could sense that Jim Olson in particular was a good person. He was doing architecture that I didn't necessarily appreciate, but I really appreciated his tenacity and his commitment to what he was doing. And I'd say Bob Faust is the same way. You just got to appreciate that against all odds, these personalities are doing great work. The artist I worked for, unbelievable optimism about the future despite the fact that everything horrible happened to him along the way. Jim is the same way. He's 85 years old and he's not a shareholder anymore, but he works for us. We're calling him our most expensive intern, and he's working on projects around the world. He couldn't be more excited about what he's working on. So there's an optimism, there's just a commitment, a loyalty, and I will say it's real dangerous right now what I'm seeing with a lot of people just jumping from office to office. I think it's okay to jump when you're young, but when you're in your middle age, by that time you better have made a commitment either to yourself in your own office or to a firm. That's what I did to a firm. I made that commitment, and the rest is history. I mean, we have seen unbelievable success and we just pinch ourselves. We wouldn't have, there was no agenda. There was never an agenda that we would grow. We're not a corporate office. If you come to the office in Seattle, you recognize it immediately. It's kind of a big studio, and it works because we have people that, I've been there for 30 odd years. I work with people that have been there for 25, 20 years. They're talented architects. They stuck with us, and they're just doing terrific work.
That's great. So is there a type of project that you enjoy most, and is there a project you're working on right now that you just are loving?
Type of project. It's really hard to answer that because I love working on just about any project. I think what's most sort of interesting for me right now are projects working with ugly buildings, if that makes sense. Buildings that people want to throw away. And because I think that's the future of architecture. If you go out there, there's a whole bunch of bad buildings out there. But those buildings that's embodied energy. That's stuff that's already there, and it's also context. So you go into them and you try to make something out of them. So there's a bunch of repurposing. The Charles Smith winery that maybe you saw, he wanted to tear down a tilt-up warehouse that was a garbage dump, basically. And I convinced him, I said, it was done in the 60s. It's got some stuff in it that's actually pretty interesting. Why don't we just strip it down to its core and see what we have? God, I couldn't be happier with that project because it is. And Hot Rod, our house was called Hot Rod House because, again, it was an existing house, a horrible house, and I just sort of enjoyed engaging this thing and making an architecture out of a horrible thing. I think that's what I'm really excited about. And there's some bigger projects we're working on. We're getting more and more into sports. We're about to start a museum with an unbelievable collection of art on a university campus. It's going to be a teaching. You asked about, what is a teaching museum? And literally, all the collection, it's a big collection, it's a very important collection, will be out on display, and the curators will be teaching classes about comparing older art with modern art. Those of you who know Lino Bobardi's project in Sao Paulo, the entire collection is on the floor, and it goes from the early I forgot what they call it. So the almost not prehistory, but like Renaissance paintings, all the way to modern paintings, and you can see all the way through the gallery from one end to another. That's not what we're going to do, but it's going to be like that, so you can go out and compare histories. Those of you that go to Brazil, I mean, Brazil on so many levels is interesting, but go to that museum. I think it's genius.
It is, yes. So it seems that we have a question from the audience.
Yes, I was curious about your most favorite or memorable area that you've worked with.
Ooh, area. That's a good one. I like all the areas, which is a cheap answer. And I think I really, yeah, I think I've never had that question asked. I've always had the question asked, what's your favorite building? You know, I'm not going to answer that because it get out to other clients. But no one has ever asked me about my favorite area. I would have said, historically, I just love being in the mountains. Mountains I'm familiar with, and the high desert. I grew up in the high desert. But, and I remember going to Hawaii and Costa Rica 20 years ago and thinking, well, oh God, this is not my place. You know, I felt really awkward in that climate and that culture. Now I love those cultures and those climates in Brazil or Hawaii, Costa Rica, Malaysia. I mean, it's stumping me because I don't know which one I'm most excited about. I probably will say if I'm most excited about the extreme spots, where you're really going someplace you don't know and you have to figure it out. That's when the last continent is Antarctica. We haven't done anything on Antarctica, and I think that would be just so totally fascinating because of the conditions. But virtually every other continent, I've learned so much about whatever that cultural or climatic situation is that it's, I'd have to say it's kind of my favorite area. What I don't really maybe have as much sort of just at this point in my career, much excitement about is a suburban location. Because suburbia is, whether it's in the Northwest or it's in the Midwest or it's in the East Coast or even in Europe, it feels sort of generic, if that makes sense. I like the extremes.
That's good. There's another
Question
question
in
there.
the-
Yeah.
You've been in the Pacific Northwest for a long time, and it treated you very well over your 3 years up there. Are there any ways that you try to give back to that area or a specific community?
I hope I'm understanding. You think I'm stretched around the world enough? Am I going back to the Northwest and really becoming more part of the community than being stretched around the world? Is that kind of your question?
Or just more just, are there any ways that your firm gives back?
Oh, yeah. Oh, that's a great question. Yes. And it's really important in the firm. We're actually quite a generous firm on a number of levels, whether it's production of projects or buildings for all sorts of agendas. One of our main, no, it's not a main, but it's a very significant part of our giving. It's not a foundation yet. We're thinking of turning it into a foundation, but we have projects that we actually work with. Like you have Rural Studio here. If Rural Studio, I think we have supported Rural Studio in the past, but if we had Rural Studio in our neck of the woods, we would support it generously. We have a thing called Sawmill, which is basically an agenda for women to learn how to build buildings. They actually build buildings. It's not exactly, oh God, what's the building agenda? I just got a mental block on it. But these are women that learn, how to weld, how to actually build buildings. And again, Rural Studio has a lot of that, and Sawmill, we're big supporters of it. We, of course, support the arts in our community. We also do something in the office where we ask the entire office to give us the topmost nonprofits that they want to support, and we'll match their support, but we'll take the top 20 and the office will support it. So if there's 2 or 3 people that want, Salma would get maybe 20 votes, and others, and there's a lot of obviously nonprofits, especially with the street people situation we have, in Seattle. So we'll figure out the top 20 and then we give pretty generously to those. So we let it, it's democratic. Is that kind of answering your question? Or just?
Yes.
Great, thanks. It's a great question because it is our responsibility. It's our neighborhood.
Just to follow a question, what qualities are most important leading a huge firm in leadership?
For, for a staff person?
Or as like for yourself as a leader?
Most important qualities? Sorry.
Yes.
For me, well, yeah. Well, that's actually an interesting question also, if I understood it correctly. What does it take to be a leader? I don't even know really what it takes to be a leader. And Jim and I have had this discussion in the past. We're not necessarily leadership quality. We don't know really how to lead. In fact, he and I were at one of our parties and there was like 200 people out there. And we were laughing because we were both saying to each other, do those people have any idea we don't know what we're doing? And because we actually didn't and still don't. But I think the reason it works, and I hope I'm answering your question on this, is that, I'm working with my co-founder. He's 85 years old and he just works and loves what he does. And I think we think you got to lead by example rather than some sort of strategy, if that makes sense. And so the colleagues, my partners right now, they're exactly the same way. So there's a personality in the firm about really working hard, being loyal to each other. Like you're a mountain climber, you're always protecting the lead, you're the belayer and you switch. Sometimes you're the lead, sometimes you're the belayer. So we have that philosophy in the firm. It's not particularly complicated or sophisticated, but it is about loyalty and trust and hard work. Thanks. Good question.
Go ahead.
Another question related to more of the community aspect. Do you have any advice that you would give to students right now who are going to be moving forward into making residential works in the housing crisis that we're in?
Oh, yeah. Well, of course, you've got one of the best examples here. Rural Studio, I think, is a little bit of a hero for a lot of us in the world of community giving and architecture. Is it the answer? I'm not sure, but it certainly is it's an agenda that is it's important because what's most important is we can't ignore the situation. I mean, we have serious housing problems in Seattle, and it's not just street people looking for places to stay. It's also just affordable housing. The West Coast is unbelievably expensive, and we work in a lot of resorts. And the people that are building those resorts and they're actually staffing those places have to drive sometimes 2 or 3 hours. And how do you house? I don't know if I know the answer. It's really a tough question, and it's an important question because it's becoming even more difficult, I think, in certain areas. So I'm not answering your question, except you have to recognize that it exists, and you have to offer up any services you can to people that have that agenda. And there certainly are groups in Seattle to house the homeless and to bring in subsidized affordable housing and sometimes market rate affordable housing. It's a tough question, I think. But construction is expensive.
Please go ahead.
I recently became aware of some research into the structural analysis of buildings against extreme weather conditions such as tornadoes, and there should be a publication coming out soon about like optimum structural designs to resist these extreme weather conditions. And I wanted to know, how would you navigate a situation with a client that wished to incorporate this research into their project?
Oh, we're always excited about that kind of agenda. If we have a client that's interested in it, because there are a lot of things happening out there that are really interesting. We're just finishing in fact, it's finished now, a Gulfport, Mississippi house that is has to deal with a 17-foot surge and the first floor has to be 23 feet off the ground. And it was interesting because FEMA was involved, and certainly the local code authorities were involved, and we came in with a structural system that was based on oil rig structural systems, and we were told that that was not an effective structural strategy because it didn't fit the rules, right? And so we had to go through, and even FEMA was resistant to it. So we had to go through our own, at our own cost, the structural analysis of why a steel building on steel columns would survive a 17-foot surge probably better than what the common building techniques were, like right next door, in the house right next door, which was about 23 feet off the ground, but its columns or walls were CMU block, reinforced CMU block. And of course, reinforced CMU block is relatively weak from a structural standpoint. But it was interesting that the bureaucratic situation resisted our research and development on a structural system. Is that making your sense? I mean, I think it leads to better projects. Frankly, it leads to really interesting projects when you address. We got fire problems, obviously, on the West Coast. Cal Fire, you cannot do a project in California, especially a rural project, without Cal Fire basically looking over your shoulder, and rightly so, when you recognize what those fires in California have done. It is unbelievable how quickly those fires spread. A good example is the glass fire, where we're doing some reconstruction of some buildings. The fire, when it was under the wind loads, went a football field in 4 seconds. Now, how are you going to outrun that fire? That gives you an idea of why it was devastating. So here's something else that came out of, and Berkeley is actually kind of leading, well, in Australia, obviously, is also leading the technology of resistive buildings. But it's not just the buildings, it's also how you bring in the emergency vehicles. So now in California, what they're developing, which I think is really interesting, those of you that are old enough probably remember the bomb shelters for nuclear bombs. Now what they're looking at is requiring you to have a fire shelter in your project, because a fire generally lasts only 2 hours on a site, and then it keeps rolling somewhere else. And the reason is they don't want you to get in your car and try to escape, because the reason the Cal fires were so devastating is the roads were full of people trying to escape, and the emergency vehicles couldn't get to the fire. So it completely screwed up things. And then people were, of course, some of them died in their cars because the fires came through. So that technology is having a huge, that issue is having a huge effect on the technology of the building, how you build them, where you build them, and the materials you use.
Thank you.
Thanks for the question. That was a good one.
We also have another question.
Yeah. It sounds the way you run projects would naturally give an opportunity to young people that are joining your firm all the experiences they would need to be a complete and total practicing architect. Just the way you run it, and I think it's very commendable that you can do it that way, just a combination of the large projects and then multiple smaller projects. And I'm just curious, I always like to hear, in addition to the way that you run the projects so that you develop your young people so that they, it's like an investment in what they can do for you. What are some of the ways that you support the professional development of the young people, just in terms of getting registered, making sure that they've got all the support that they need, so when they're taking examinations, So that, all those type things, I think that's, for a lot of people here, that's an important thing, and whatever you can share on that would probably help them in their initial, wherever they go to work.
Yeah, okay, there's, yeah, we have a mentorship program in the office to do exactly, to address exactly what the question is about, AIA agendas, licensing agendas, and obviously support where we can. The licensing thing is actually pretty interesting, and I think this ties in with your question. What we think is more important than licensing is actually becoming an architect. Being licensed is not necessarily an architect. I got my license early in my career because I lucked out. I took the exam, and back then everybody would flunk at least twice. And I took the exam and I passed, and I said to my dad, I think I was like 23 years old or something like that. I said, wow, I don't think I'm an architect. And he said, you're not. And I know what he meant, because I don't think I was an architect. I was licensed to do architecture, but I didn't know actually what I was doing. So in our office, what we try to do is, as somebody has once called it, a finishing school for academics, is we really are trying to train kids to take their academic experiences, which are so important, but then if you want to be an architect, work with understanding first what you don't know, because I'll be really frank, when you graduate, and when I graduated, I didn't know what I didn't know. I mean, and you got to first learn what you don't know in the business and delivery of architecture, and then you've got to figure out how to actually deliver it. And I'll say I think that takes about 10 years. So being licensed is important. Get that over with as quickly as possible, because it is a pain. And they really are testing you for the most part based on your academic experiences. Because again, the tests we were given was structure, and it wasn't really architecture. It was kind of history. You should know that, but structure. You work with structural engineers. You certainly should understand the basis of structure, but you don't have to know it. The formulas and how to. We had to design beams and moment frames. Oh, no one does that, but you got to know how they work and got to know why they work. Does this make sense to everybody? I think really the training of architects, hopefully in our office, is actually training you to be an architect. And regardless if you got your license, again, we urge everybody to get licensed as quickly as possible. Join the AIA. Don't avoid the AIA. Yeah, it's imperfect, but it's our professional organization, and you should just be loyal to the professional or AIA. Is that answering your question?
Yeah. Please go ahead.
Hey, I had a question as it relates particularly to landscape and the way you think about design. I know you talked about your passion for being in extreme landscapes, particularly in the great outdoors. And I'm curious about, I'd love to hear you talk about how you think about landscape in the context of your architecture, but I'm particularly interested in how you think about extreme urban landscapes. I see projects in LA and New York and South Korea, and even in Seattle. How do you think about, I guess, framing those landscapes or responding to those landscapes?
Boy, am I glad you asked that question, because what I mean by extreme landscapes is not necessarily rural landscapes. It's urban landscapes, the extreme urban landscapes. Some of the most interesting landscapes, New York, LA, Rio de Janeiro, where really there are, those are landscapes, right? They're manipulated landscapes. So here's something I find really interesting about architects, and again, maybe I'm talking to professors here as much as students. Students that come out of an architecture program, and even a lot of architects that I work with that are mid-career, it's really interesting they don't think outside the box. They don't think that, in fact, the answers are outside the properties lines. And in an urban setting, the answers aren't there. The answers are, around. In fact, if how you creatively bring those answers back into the project, those are the most important. That makes a place idiosyncratic to its place, makes it authentic to its place. So the way I try to think, I guess I'm just more interested in what's happening around than almost what I see what's happening on the project. So context, it's an overused word, but it is absolutely important. It's not about this thing, it's about everything around that thing, and that is urban, that is rural, that's suburban. It's, what are you learning from that place? It's climatic, it's technology, of course. Is that answering your question?
Yes. Yeah.
It's a really important question, I think, to understand. And again, just to the professors, floor plans, I see a weakness in floor planning coming out of schools. I don't know if that's true for Auburn, because we have great luck hiring Auburn students, and it may be that you guys have that agenda here that's really strong, but it's also understanding the context of the place, not just the style of the buildings on the block surrounding it, but the big context. Go way outside, and how it sort of onion skins back to your project. And that's where the brilliant, your design, I think, will be more brilliant. You'll learn stuff out here, and you can bring that in here, and it'll make a better project, I think.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good question.
My name's Nelson Bracken. I had the distinct pleasure of knowing Bob Faust. I also had the distinct pleasure, because of Bob Faust, meeting Bruce Goff. And you mentioned Bruce Goff, and I'm interested in hearing what your thoughts are on him, and particularly if you've been to the Taylor House in Seattle.
Yeah.
And I saw that you have the house in Highland, North Carolina, and I was wondering if you do James Howard Fox's work there. And I thank you very much.
Oh, thank you. Well, Bob's work, Bruce's work. We worked in Tulsa a bit, so we saw some of the work in Tulsa. We were working on the Bob Dylan exhibit. It's almost, for me, I just am always stopped in my tracks, because I don't know how he got there. I just am totally baffled, and I find it completely interesting when somebody comes at it so skillfully, because that's the other thing. It's not just about being crazy for crazy's sake, because we've seen some of that stuff. We see some of that stuff in California, and you go to it and you go, well, so what? But when it's done skillfully, like it is with Faust and Goff and others, I just find it completely, and it's so antithetical to my DNA, I find it completely interesting. It's like listening to music that maybe you don't understand, but there's something about it that's really important. I know the Taylor House in Seattle. I'll just be frank, I don't think that really is one of his better projects. And when I see some of the other things, I'm just blown away by it. And I don't know if that was a bad client. And it's not good.
What Goff did is he did some 8.5 by 11 drawings, and he sent those to the Taylors.
Oh.
and
Yeah.
then they proceeded with it to finish it. But he did that a number of different times.
Probably later on in his career. And
he very early were.
Oh, is that right? Well, it's interesting you say that, because we were talking about this. Technically, we have an issue in Seattle of waterproofing, because we got water from the ground, water from the air, and water or from the side, and water from the air, because we have high humidity, groundwater, and then, of course, a constant rain. It's not just like a big dump rain. It's like an Evian spa treatment. It's just like this drizzle, and it works a house. And unfortunately, the house is really in terrible shape. It wasn't detailed well with waterproofing. And I can imagine with some of the other projects, they're so complex that I look at them as detailed nightmares, but in certain climates, they're probably really great. I mean, well, they are great. They're fantastic projects.
You mentioned you were doing that house in Gulfport. you know the Gutman House that was designed by Bruce Goff that Bob Faust built
Oh, really?
in Gulfport. It was
Well,
a steel structure.
I saw the drawings. That was actually built?
Yeah, it was built in Gulfport. It was a steel structure that was elevated.
Fantastic, because ahead of their time. And that's what I was going to recommend on the archives, to show the photograph of the built structure, because it would really be interesting to know, some of those projects might have been speculative. Some of ours are also, and some of them are actually built. And those that are built, that's very impressive. I would just recommend having some current photographs and maybe some historic photographs.
Thank you.
Thank you. Great question. And obviously, huge admirer now of Bob Faust, as I always was of Bruce. But Bruce, the architecture is not my DNA, but walking through those projects and looking at those plans, I could recognize he was a terrific architect that understood flow, that understood plans, understood what the body size and how you move from room to room. He really was an architect of the highest order. And I'll also say that I worked in a community that had some architects in Spokane, northern Idaho, architects of the highest order, and no one has heard of them. And there is a community of architects, especially in the 50s and the 60s and some in the 70s, that did terrific work. And I wish they had the same exposure, that some of the more media darlings out there have had. I always tell the story, when I started college in 1974, I was in physics, but it was probably 1976 when I actually was serious about architecture. And somebody introduced me to Carlos Scarpa. No one knew who Carlos Scarpa was when I was a student. And obviously that's changed at this point. But all of a sudden Carlos disappeared from the media in a sense, and it came back after the Japanese publication. And my dad actually met Carlos when my dad was a student at the ETH in Zurich, and he would mention this architect in Italy, and I didn't know who it was. And, the rest is history. Obviously, it's brilliant work. You can tell. Obviously, it affected me.
Hi. I'm not an architect. I'm a landscape architect background, but I'm just curious. A lot of your images show this vivid landscape and really show placemaking in itself. And I'm just curious if you could speak on if your office does that, or do you guys work in cooperation with another firm? Yeah.
Really, yeah. So we're struggling with that. And we've always been an architecture firm because we did small projects. You're almost expected to do interior design, the architecture, and the landscape architecture. So we would always do it all. But as you get more complicated projects or more difficult projects to follow through, we, of course, would work with terrific interior designers. And the way we describe interior design, and this is important because we do come from an interior design background, is you turn the building upside down, everything that falls out, we would say is interior design. Everything that stays in the building is interior architecture. And there's an important distinction there. So, but in the landscape, we would do the same thing. We would do all the hardscape and do the planning, the pathways, the pools, the parking lots, whatever. And then we'd have a horticulturist come in and actually do the stuff we don't know anything about, especially if we're working in different climates. We have started, we've had an interior design group we don't call ourselves interior designers, but we have a 20-person interior design group, and that's what they do. They do the stuff that falls out of the building. And we have a very small landscape group. And I would say the landscape group is not working as well, and even the interior design group is not working as well as some of the consultants that we will work with. These are colleagues that have their own interior design group and their own landscape site planning group. They're terrific, And so it's a balance, sometimes we'll use our group to sort of help us out, but if we really got a strong agenda for interior design for a large project or a complicated project, or a large site, we'll work with outside consultants. And interesting point on that is because we do residential work at pretty high level, there's a big difference in landscape architecture. And I asked this question with Justin, I said, so your landscape architecture program here is mostly about site planning and sort of large ecosystems. And I got kind of a yes on that. I come from a background working with a landscape architect that started Eugene, University of Oregon's landscape architecture. And his position always was, he said it was a real problem that the school has turned from a garden design landscape architecture agenda to a large ecosystem landscape design site work group. And he said there's nothing wrong with the large scale, but he said you learn everything, well, like we talk about small projects, you learn everything from the garden and then you take it to the large. And his point, Ron's point was that you first have to understand the garden and then you understand the larger ecosystem, which I think is interesting. It's not necessarily my position, but it was Ron Lovensure's position.
Thank you. And then I just have like one last question. What is advice you'd give to your younger self? How that you're...
To me?
Yeah.
When I was younger?
Yeah.
Patience. I think, you just got to be patient and it's hard to understand that as the years go by, it doesn't seem to, things don't seem to be changing that quickly, and then it's just geometric. If you kind of keep your shoulders into it, you work hard, you maintain optimism, and you just maintain your integrity, just keep working it. And all of a sudden, there's an agenda, a crescendo that just will almost be, frankly, overwhelming, but you have to be patient. And I don't think I was patient. Thank you.
Hi, speaking for myself, I was introduced to your work through a lot of smaller scale residential projects, and I think that's probably some of your most iconic work, and that's where a lot of the designs a lot of the motifs that you use and a lot of the most unique elements of your work come through. And I was curious, as your firm has continued to get larger projects with larger clients and bigger budgets, have you had any difficulty in kind of maintaining those stylistic choices or that design philosophy?
Yeah, that is a really important question for us. Are we being as innovative as we were back, 20, 25 years ago when we were a little scrappier? We were. I'm not sure I know the answer to that. I do know that there's a number of innovations happening right now on some of our projects that are really exciting and fairly risky. Your point is a really good one about the small projects. The small projects are our R&D kitchen, if that makes sense. And that's where we experiment with an idea that can be turned over quickly and understanding the risks, understanding, all the issues involved with it, material risks, physical risks, and just liability risks. And so it takes a long time for some of those studies, the R&D kitchen, in a way, to develop those far enough that they can start showing up in the commercial work, because the commercial or the institutional work, probably saw the wooden boat shop with the screens that went up and down, or I don't think the Burke actually show they have a huge window on the Burke. The only way we could get those projects or those institutions or those groups to buy off on it is that we had already proven ourselves at the kitchen, if that makes sense. And they could see it, they could feel it, they could move it, and then they were convinced that it wasn't, because obviously an institution, some of those are attractive nuisances, they could be misused, and accidents can happen, and because they're outside the usual, they become kind of targets for lawsuits. So you have to really be careful about some of those innovations. Now, those are the sort of moving innovations, but there are other innovations about hardware or materials or glazing strategies that we're experimenting with right now, or fabrication, prefab. We're working a lot with, in fact, the Hawaii projects. Virtually all the Hawaii projects, and certainly the project that was way up north that you might have seen on the barge, those are all component built, prefab, experimental, bleeding edge. Learned a lot from those projects, and they're all residential projects. And we're now, because we have our own DNA in those and our own sort of strategies, we're using some of those to begin thinking about delivering commercial and institutional projects. But it happened at the residential level. It doesn't have to be residential. It could be even TI. I mean, we did a lot of, tenant improvement innovation, because those go so quickly. Anything you can do to turn over an idea quickly and understand it, those are the projects that become really the underpinning for the larger projects. Does that kind of make some sense?
Yes, thank you.
Thanks. Yeah.
Please, go ahead. Oh. Do we have time for one more? Okay, please, go ahead.
Yeah, I think it's, the thing that's interesting about your work is that it seems to be that there's some sort of intentional engagement with the more analog. And I'm curious if you mentioned before the value of drawing in your practice, and I think when I went to architecture school, there was still a pretty heavy emphasis on drawing and building models. I'm wondering if you could speak to, in your own way, what you think the value is of sort of sticking to or continuing to use more analog methods out of fear of not being too nostalgic, but just out of a belief that they are still valuable. I'm curious what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, I don't want to talk like the old guy because I really am the old guy, and I learned how to use a pencil, and pencils are really important to me. Drawing kind of is a direct link to understanding what I'm doing. I think I'll just be frank, I think AutoCAD and Revit are really super cumbersome. I think they really are almost like thuggish, and I see a lot of the design. If somebody's using those tools for design, it just doesn't work. And I'll just be frank, that's going to change. I've seen, obviously, with a lot of the new applications and the new systems, it's becoming really smarter and smarter and becoming more fluid. I just see those as tools. AI, I fully embrace AI. I mean, it's just a tool, and if you use it right, and if you think about it in the right way, it's just another way of improving how you deliver a project. So I absolutely agree, sketching or hand drawing is really important, because if you're on a job site and somebody doesn't understand something, you can draw it on a piece of plywood. You can't haul out your laptop and fire up your program to basically deliver a detail or whatever. You can draw it. I think that's useful, because that's analog, the way you build to a point. We do use a lot of prefabricated component building strategies now, where it's built in British Columbia and it's shipped to Hawaii or Costa Rica or to the US. And we're pretty heavily into that delivery process. I don't want to romanticize analog, but analog has a place. And in particular, if it's analog in your head rather than in the computer, that's where the magic, I think, happens. And once what's happening on your digitally in your head, in a way, if this makes sense, the digital formats are going to be fantastic. Is that answering your question? I'm not afraid of any of the digital analog stuff or the digital stuff. I just think you have to look at it realistically. And if I've been at this for so many years, I know what's good and know what's not good when I look at a floor plan or I look at a delivery of a set of drawings. And it doesn't matter if it came from hand or from digital. I will say our digital drawings are less nuanced and less sort of poetic than it was when we hand drew, because when you hand draw, you're making nuanced, almost intuitive changes to a proportion. You don't even really recognize it. If you're on a digital format, you're not really doing that. You're doing something else. And I think our work is less poetic with a digital format, and I think virtually everybody's work is less poetic. Is that going to be the future? I don't think so. I think as the digital formats become stronger and stronger, I think you can go back to that nuance. But right now, I mean, you have to embrace it. It's there, it's here, it's efficient in one way, and it's really inefficient in another way. I don't know if you all noticed, but our drawings and Bob's drawings, Bob Faust's drawings, if he did a house set of plans, it was probably this thick. Our house drawings are like telephone books at this point, because it's so easy to generate all these images and all these sections and all these cuts. I'm sorry for that. But and those of you in the class of '74 will recognize this. All of us that hand drew knew that it was a physical act. So you designed and you set up your CDs in a way that you would not have to lean over. So you would do one section that answered, or 2 or 3 sections that answered all the questions around a building, because you have this 9-pound thing, hanging over, and you always have bad backs now because we did that. But now you just cut, and you have one little change here, one little change here. That's a real problem for a builder, because they just look at this set and they just get exhausted looking at it, rather than looking at 2 or 3 sections and understanding this is what the architect was intending. It's like an instruction. Basically what we do is an instruction manual, right? When you get an instruction manual and you see an instruction manual that's thick, do you actually go through it all, or do you just start assembling it? If it's thinner, you go through it, you understand it, and then you build your thing. Does that kind of make sense? And I think that's the nature of hand drawing, is you are more efficient about design, delivery of that design, and then also the poetics, the nuances.
Absolutely. Thanks, Tom.
So before we close, I would just like to thank the lectures committee for helping to organize this, Shelley, Marlia, and Alex, and advancement team for their effort. Madison Champion, communications, has also asked me to comment that there are some codes out there. Evidently, a lot of people have been using the step and repeat photo booth, so pick up a card if you want to download the link to photos you've taken. I'd also like to thank Hannah, and a big thanks to Olivia Hayes for all their work in putting this together. And then lastly, I'd like to thank Ernesto and Jen for moderating this session, and all of you for participating. And finally, Tom, thank you for joining us today. So thank you all. Please join us in the lobby.